So welcome everybody. I'm absolutely delighted that Sue is here. Sue, as some of you may know, is Emeritus Professor of Academic Practice from the University of Cumbria. She's written extensively on assessment and has been really a leader in this field. And I think she's particularly somebody worth reading and worth hearing from, because she has a very, I think, iconoclastic approach to assessment that's refreshing and much needed. So I'm sure we'll have lots of food for thought today.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me back. This is my alma mater. It comes with my PhD. Colin was my supervisor, and he's still here, so that's either he's old or I'm very young. Let's put it like that. Okay, all right, well, let's get started then. I'll just tell you why I'm interested in this, or why I got interested in this area. Because about 10 or 12 years ago now, I started working with colleagues who were struggling with a lot of students who you might describe as widening participation, who seemed to be really struggling to know what was expected of them in their assignments. And we did various projects with them. And then we talked to the students about their experience of these projects. And the big message that came over from them was, it's all very well having all these criteria and things, but actually you need to know what that tutor wants. Because what that tutor wants is often different to what that tutor wants. And that made me get really interested in what tutors were looking for when they were marking work. And so that's where this is all spun off from. So just to, I'll also say that I'm going to do this in kind of 3 chunks. And my idea is that in between those chunks, we have a bit of discussion about your views and reactions to it, and relationship to your work or your research or whatever, rather than just one long chunk and question. So I hope that will work for us. So assessment criteria, I've watched them come in during my career as an academic, and really they've been designed, I think, as I put on this slide, to just make the processes and judgments in terms of university and assignments at other levels, but particularly we're talking here at higher education level, more transparent to staff and students, reduce the arbitrariness. So much so that they become, just expected. And if you look in the requirements of the Quality Assurance Agency for assessment, if you don't offer your student assessment criteria, you're considered to be letting them down on that front. So there are lots of benefits. It's ethical practice. It provides guidance. They're supposed to improve the objectivity of marking, to help communicate feedback, and all those sorts of things. But the reality is actually that we have asserted, and lots of people have asserted these strengths for assessment criteria, but with very little research to actually show that they work that way. So in this seminar, in a way, what I'm going to try and do is look at some research that's been taken place in the past, and a particular project, to investigate how academics actually use assessment criteria. And then having done that and looking at that, then have some discussion about what that means for helping students, and also thinking about things like fairness and standards in our marking. So let's just have a couple of minutes on the previous research. Whether you like it or not, the research on marking at higher education level, i.e. What we might describe as more open-ended and complex assignments. So I'm not counting sort of multiple choice quizzes here, but the vast bulk of assessment in higher education. The reliability and consistency of standards in studies is just very, very poor. And this goes back to research, the earliest research. I mean, I've only put relatively new stuff up there, but the 1930s, there was a study of it, and several other in-between times, that's shown that there is really very, very poor reliability in marking. Despite what we often think, and when you talk to tutors about it, they say, oh yes, we both mark things, and when we get together, we generally agree on the marks. And that's the sort of common, often, my experience, the common view, but actually empirical studies don't find that at all. When we look at the cause of that inconsistency, again, there's been significant research here. Now, when I use the term assessment criteria, I'm using it generically, because one of the things that's come out in the research is that we find that staff use that term to mean various different things. They use it to mean things like the learning outcomes that work is being assessed against, or grade descriptors. Sometimes it's called standards, particularly in professional settings, or rubrics. There's all sorts of terms. So when I say assessment criteria, I'm using it in a broad sense to mean some sort of criteria against which people are making judgments about students' work. So these are the things that are coming up in the research. First of all, that people bring to their marking their different previous experience, their different knowledge of the subject matter, of what their view of what the assignment was about, and also different values. That's come out in the research. So some people, particularly valuing students' effort, or wanting to take into account aspects of their background or their disability and things like that. And that leads to staff developing marking habits. Work we've done, which is probably a different way of describing the same thing, is about academics developing their own personal standards frameworks, by which a kind of lens through which they look at students' work and determines what they see and what they how they judge it. People also have different expectations of standards at different levels. So what you consider constitutes satisfactory, someone else might think it constitutes good or excellent or whatever. So we have a different view of those. There's a number of studies that show that people actually either deliberately or not deliberately don't actually pay attention to assessment criteria, even when they're provided. In a marking study we did, where we got people thinking aloud while they were marking student work, at least half the tutors had no documentation about the assignment with them while they were marking, and they weren't referring to it. And for the most part, when they talked about that, they said, because, well, I just know the criteria. They're kind of internalized. I know what a 2-1 looks like. I know what a 2-2 looks like. And probably many of you sitting around here who are established markers have that sense that you don't need to be referring to specific criteria in order to do that. People interpret criteria and standards differently, and that obviously relates to the first one in terms of their professional experience and what they think is important. There's been a number of studies that show that individuals use personal criteria different to those stated, and those might be criteria, for example, knowledge of individual students and the effort they've put in, and how much they've attended class, and things like that might actually impact on, they're bringing in criteria that aren't the ones that have been stated to students or in the marking. And of course, that's one of the reasons I think that bodies like the National Union of Students have often pressurized for anonymous marking, because they have a feeling that that goes on. Actually, there's limited studies that show that it goes on in a way that has a systematic effect on different groups, but there certainly is evidence that people use their own criteria. Also, people give importance to different criteria. You only need to have a conversation with staff to find the person who gets really upset about students who don't write their references in the right way. My daughter had a master's marker who seemed to be completely obsessed with semicolons, judging by the comments. And so you yourselves, perhaps reflecting, if you are markers or you've been marked, on things that really upset you. There was an interesting article in Assessment and Evaluation a few years ago called things like irritations and impressions in assessment. What were the things that irritated and impressed markers? Sadly, the things that irritated were all sort of what we call surface characteristics, like aspects of referencing, grammar, presentation. But sadly, even more sadly, the things that impress people seem to be where students have got those things right. So anyway. And then the last one from this list is the people focus on different aspects of students' work. So that links a little bit to the importance given to different criteria, but people are actually looking at things. So, for example, maybe focusing on the introductions or the conclusions in an essay for some people might be particularly important. Of course, these are all interlinked, but you can see that there are multiple ways in which inconsistency can appear if you take into account all of those things. And I thought just before I go on to talk about our research on this, it might be just a minute or two to have a discussion with your partner to say, well, does this reflect your experience? Is this a pile of rubbish? It's not like that in the real world, or is this true? So there's a question. What's your experience of reliability and standards in marking or being marked? Because we've all been on the receiving end of being marked. Even having people look at your research papers when you send those off for marking, when you submit them, they're being marked by peer reviewers. Just have a minute or two with the person sitting next to you on either side of you. What's your experience of that? And have you found assessment criteria to be helpful? Can I just get you back again? Okay, thank you for coming back to the larger group. I just wondered if anybody from their conversations wants to chip in a comment in relation to either of those questions, really, whether, rather than, I'm not suggesting we have a long, big debate here, but was there anything particular that your response come out of the discussion? Colin?
There's two things. One is that the reliability issue does depend on what degree of fineness you're trying to bring into your mark. So Stephen and I was talking about the difference between haggling over whether it's 66 or 65, which both agree with the tiny points. So it's been all the difference between deciding is this a good 2-1 or a marginal average 2-1, that kind of thing. So the more you're into that kind of categorical approach, the more you ought to be able to arrive at judgment. And the other point I thought was that I was just wondering about the research that you referred to, showing the non-reliability of the marking. I don't know it as well as you do, obviously, but I'm guessing a lot is just getting two people to separately mark and show that they come up with different marks. Whereas very often there's a process involved, which involves a team of people, a team often just two, there's a team of people arriving at a judgment that you can, in the end, say, I'm confident that that's a reliable judgment. We may have been a bit part to begin with, but now we've gone through a process, we are confident that we've got a reliable outcome for that person. So I'm not quite sure that there. And then the other thing we discussed was there's obviously an important summative and formative difference.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to respond to things at the moment because I want to present the research and then we can. But I mean, there are all good points to throw in. I mean, the moderation, and that's another time I'll come and do a moderation there because that's an area of where we put huge amounts of energy in a completely unresearched area of practice. And any other people want to throw in things like that came from their discussion at this point?
You should put in your ranking. We said that the logical conclusion of your argument might be that there is no objectivity in higher education marking, and then this idea came up.
Oh, well, I know somebody else who researches this area, and his position is that putting increasingly complex rubrics is actually obstructing marking. The way you make them more and more complex, what you actually do is make people less and less able to make judgments. So in his view, what you do is to create a very simple judgment situation, which is to take two pieces of work and say which of those is the better. It's called adaptive comparative judgment, if you come across.
Yeah.
And you can then use a computer system to aggregate all of those judgments, hundreds of them, and what you end up with is a rank order of students, not necessarily separated into grade band. And so the point is that this mediating artifact of these increasingly complex items, the rubrics and all this kind of thing, are actually a problem, not anything that can be solved.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, there is certainly research showing that humans, without being really knowledgeable about it, humans are more able to rank pieces of work than reliably grade them, which is what you're talking about there. Okay. Any other final? All right. Well, I'll tell you about our study then, and these things all can be for further discussion. This has been part of a wider project actually that was looking at the use of standards by experienced examiners, and by experience we took people who'd been appointed to external examining positions in the UK. So in order to do that, they had to have a reasonable track record as an assessor in more than one institution, and that's what we mean by experienced here. And because we think we lack studies on how academics work with standards and work with criteria, we were interested in doing that. So this is what part of the project was investigating. And just to be fair to my colleagues, this was part of a collaborative project with people at Oxford Brookes University. Margaret Price was the academic lead there, and Jane and Birgit were two brilliant research assistants. So this is what we did. We worked with 24 experienced examiners from 4 disciplines, and we got disciplines sort of across the different areas. So there was psychology, chemistry, history, and nursing, professional area. They came from very diverse UK universities, from brand new ones like Cumbria to what you might Russell Group universities. And each of them was asked to consider 5 borderline examples of typical assignments in their area of work. So for history, for example, it was an essay. In chemistry, it was a problem examination questions. We chose borderline ones on the 2122 borderline because we wanted to look at kind of nuanced judgment. We reckoned if we gave people sort of fails and first, then we would probably get some very coarse judgments. So that's what we did. And we used something called Kelly's repertory grids to do this. I don't know how familiar people are with that, but I'll try and explain it. But we did that because we wanted to really get inside what it was that they were using, what they were noticing in student work in order to differentiate between them. And we asked the tutors to look, we gave them a week or so in advance of the interview to look at these pieces of work, to make notes on them, as though they were marking them. And we gave them, all except for the chemistry, where we didn't have any criteria model answer, we gave them a set of criteria that they could use. They were generic criteria, for example, a generic psychology essay, history essay, and the actual criteria the nursing students were given. I'll try and explain this for those who are not familiar. We gave them 5 assignments because in the Kelly's repertory drill approach, you work with combinations of 3 elements. Okay, in our case, the elements were assignments, because 5 gives you the opportunities for 10 different combinations, okay, 10 different ways they can go together. So we would start off, the researcher would start off saying, all right, you've got assignment A, B, and C. You've looked at those, you made notes on that. Tell us how you think 2 of those are similar in the way that the other one is different. So if we look at, this thing doesn't work here, but so this first row, the lecturer, the examiner would say, well, actually 2 of them had excellent argument, and the 3rd one only had adequate argument. All right, that's the construct that they have generated from their looking at the work. So although we gave them criteria, that's come from their looking at the work. And then we say, okay, if excellent argument is 1 and adequate argument is 5, can you look at all of them and say roughly how you grade them? So this person thought that the assignment A had excellent argument, gave it 1, and assignment C only had adequate argument and gave it 5, and these are in between. And having done that, they would then shuffle them around and give them another combination of 3. So started with A, B, C, then it was C, D, E, etc., and say, okay, let's do it again. And gradually, as you give them the different combinations, the different constructs that they are created by what they notice in the work. So, you know, the second one was 2 of them had less depth of detail and knowledge, whereas the third one had broad and detailed knowledge. So that's what we mean about trying to sort of get at what they were noticing in doing this assessing of work in a way that asking them to talk about what they noticed is sort of one step removed. We then asked them to roughly give us an impression of what kind of grade they thought the work would be worth. So this person thought there was a lot of very high scoring work there. They gave 3 of them a first, a low 2-1, and a sort of borderline 2-1, 2-2. And then finally we said, okay, if you're making judgments about student work, which of these do you think are most important? So this person reckoned that excellence, argument, knowledge was really important, gave it 1, whereas the quality of the expression or how well written was much lower down at 7. So this was them sort of ranking what they thought was important when they marked. I'm going to base our results on the information that came from analysis of these. We did actually follow it up with an interview where we got them to talk about where they felt their standards had come from and such like, but that's another paper. So what did we find out? Well, we found out exactly, in a way, what had been found out before, and it wasn't unexpected. What we did was, just like you said, we didn't pay too much attention to the marks because, in a way, they were nervous about those because they were generated, they weren't courses they'd taught, they didn't know a huge amount about the teaching and the nature of the students, things like that. So we were more interested in how the people ranked the work. And what was interesting was that they were ranked all over the place. So this table, I'm sorry these tables are slightly complicated, but let's just choose this cell. This is the chemistry assignments. Assignment A in chemistry was ranked between first, the best assignment, and the worst, the fifth assignment, by different examiners. And if you look at that, you can see that at least 9, nearly half of them, were ranked as best or worst by different examiners. So that's quite interesting, given other research that says that actually ranking is more reliable than marking. We didn't actually find that at all. We didn't find very much consistency of ranking. And the reason I've circled that one is because it's the only one where the ranking was the same across all 5 examiners, first to joint first. All the rest were ranked at least a couple of differences, points different. So that was the overall consistency of judgment. So in a sense, we were reinforcing what had come before. In a way, that wasn't a surprise. What was most interested, though, is how people use those constructs, how they use those criteria, and why it might lead to such differences in the judgment about them. And so we took history, and the reason we took the history examiners was because they tended to generate more of the same constructs than other people who generated wildly different ones. So just looking at history then, just to reinforce, they had similar wide range of marks amongst them. So actually this thing doesn't work on here. You can see that SAA amongst historians was judged as being between a first and a 2-2 by different examiners, first and 2-2, 2-1 to a third. So there was a range, people thought there was a range of different quality there. And also a range of the ranking between them. So history was very similar to all of them. So we felt it was a reasonable case study to look at. What is interesting is we often talk about difference in markers, hard markers, soft markers. What we did find, and I recognise this is a very small case study, just to sort of illustrate and help us think about things, is that we did find that examiners were more or less prepared to use the full scale. So the red ones in this bottom box here, examiner 3 and examiner 5, really were only prepared to go sort of between a 2-2 and a 2-1 in all their marks, whereas some of the others were prepared to go from a first to a 2-2 or a first to a third. And I think that's quite interesting. It does reinforce that in exam boards, for example, we should be looking at the distribution of marks that people use, because it can have quite a significant influence on students. If you're being marked by examiner 3 there, the chance perhaps of getting a first class mark is quite slim. Whereas if you're being examined by examiner 4, well, then you have a better chance of that. So that was an interesting finding. But let's look at the, that just says what I've just said now, so I'm not going to hang around with it. But we were just interested in looking at picking this a bit to find out what was going on with these constructs. And the 5 potential reasons seem to emerge. The first one is that people are perhaps using different criteria to those published. So when we looked at what the constructs the historians came up with, we found that there were 17 different constructs, and about 18 different constructs, and about 7 of those related to the criteria we'd given them. So there were lots of other criteria, in a sense, that they were applying to the work. And when you look at these, none of them would look out of place in a list of assessment criteria for an essay. They all make sense. But generally speaking, we don't give students 17 assessment criteria. We try to give them a much more limited number, maybe 5 or 6 or whatever. But so perhaps what we're asking ourselves here is maybe people are using additional criteria that aren't explicit in what's being given to students. Maybe, as Sadler says, they're not necessarily conscious of what they're using because they've been doing it for so long and it's so tacit. A lot of the arguments about marking is this the tacit nature of the knowledge we bring to it, that we're not aware that that's going on. However, if we're telling students that we're marking against a certain set of criteria, but we're using this broader pool, maybe there are issues there. I mean, one interesting study which rather reinforces this is, well, two studies that replicated the same finding. If students submit their work in 12-point font, as opposed to 10-point font, on average, they get 1 degree classification higher. Now, that's been replicated in another study, and it could do to replicate in other studies. Now, I suspect none of us are conscious when we're marking of how we are influenced by the ease we're able to just read the text. That then helps us to understand more quickly. And anyway, those two studies have found that result, and that might be part of this. Do I need to do something here? No. That sounds it. Okay, so that was the first one. That people are using different criteria. As I say, that's probably reinforcing what's come before. The other thing other second reason was that assessors seem to have different sense of the appropriate, whoops, I've leapt. Don't know, I think when I banged that, I must have whipped it. Yeah, that says, reason 2, assessors have different understanding of shared criteria. So we found, for example, that all the historians talked about historiography. And I apologize, the text is a bit small, but these are their constructs. So engages well with historiography, historiographically determined, engagement with historiography. I don't know what historiography means, to tell the truth. It's obviously very important to historians because they all said that it was something that was valid. Now, if we look at 1, they describe it as engages well with historiography or hardly engages. That's their construct. And examiner 3, engagement with historiography, almost exactly the same wording, unawareness of historiography. But look at how they grade. You know, SAD, they're giving completely opposite, SAE, completely opposite scores. Can we say that they've got the same understanding of what that means in student work if they make such a different judgment about it? They both think they're making judgments about the engagement with historiography, but what does that mean for them? So that's the second one, really. You know, this notion that although we have used the same words as academics, our meaning of it, particularly with complex ideas like that, may be complicated. Similarly, this is the same with argument. A lot of them talked about the quality of argument in assignments, but here we can see them giving quite different, I don't know why I highlighted those ones, but quite different. This person, they all give it 5, this person gives it 1. They all give it 4, this person gives it 2. They all give it 1, this person gives it 5. Do they have the same understanding of argument? I think not. I think that they're looking for something different in there, but they use the same term. And you could say that this is something to do with our research, because we, in order to come up with these constructs, we put together things that had slightly different descriptions, but they all talked about argument. But you could say when we're writing assessment criteria, we tend to use words like argument and just hope that everybody will understand them in the same way. So it's an interesting thing. The third reason was that people seem to have a different sense of standards for each criterion. So here's argument again. 3 of the examiners give almost identical scores for argument. Great, that's good, bit of consistency. But this assessor is describing that as excellent, whereas this assessor is only talking about them as reasonable. Now, again, that's suggesting that they have a different view of what constitutes really good or not so good, and in sets of criteria or rubrics in particular, we use terms like excellent, satisfactory, good, to delineate the different levels we might give first, 2 1s, 2 2s. But perhaps those sense of what those standards mean differs. Okay. The fourth reason is that maybe our constructs or the criteria we use are so complex in themselves, in a sense, that there may be sub-criteria under them that are hidden to view. I need to do this without jumping forward, jump back. And here we've used the construct of structure. 5 of the history tutors, examiners used structure as one of the things that they looked at. Some of them used it twice, in fact, so that's why they've got 2 rows there. Now, interestingly, these tutors are very much in agreement about 3 of the students' pieces of work, but they're much less in agreement about 2 of the other pieces of work. And we wondered whether that's because their constructs actually of structure are slightly different. So this person's talking about extremely well-structured and not so well-structured, whereas this one is talking about clear structure and signposting, or jumps in with no signposting. So maybe, although structure is the overall term, there is something going on that... Oh, I see, yeah, that will...
Maybe just the screen on the wall.
No.
It's traditional that we have one technological
Yeah, it's okay.
with every seminar.
That's all right.
You'll be spoiled if you get a second.
Oh, here it comes. Thank you. I'm sure that was for all our benefits. You were trying. Okay, just to go back before. So I wonder whether this person's, one of these people, number 6, structure includes a sort of subcategory which is about signposting within structure, and that's revealed here. In a sense, this whole study is we're not proving things so much as finding things that need investigating, or well, not need investigating, might begin to help us explain why criteria aren't working in the way we want them to work. And in fact, when we looked at structure, we found that there were loads of different ways in which the tutors thought about structure: logical, analytical, thematical, chronological, level of balancing the level of attention, effective, etc. So that when we might write structure, the quality of structure in a set of criteria, we may actually be hiding lots of different sub-ways of thinking of structure, or the different components that contribute to a student's assignment. So, the last thing was about the final column on our referee grid. Remember I said at the beginning, we asked people to rank the importance of the different constructs. And what we found was, in fact, that there was almost no consistency in what people ranked as most important, except that almost everybody ranked what you might call, we call it global in our writing about it, the global characteristic of assignment. That's the substantive focus, the content. They ranked those criteria more important than the criteria to do with what we call surface characteristics, so technical, grammar, referencing, those sorts of things. So there was that. But in terms of the other constructs, the people were very varied. So, for example, structure was ranked between the most important and the 5th important, and historiography was ranked between the 2nd most important and the 5th most important. Again, there is a slight problem with using the rep grid, because there was a limit to how many constructs could be developed in terms of this ranking. So we're not trying to pretend any major numerical evidence here, but just highlighting these issues in terms of thinking about how we use criteria. So there you are. You can see that it lends up, well, in fact, I think it's time for a bit of discussion. And one of the questions which you raised here, I think, before, you may want to ask questions about the research and the methodology and such like, but also, should we start recognizing that really it's impossible to get a right mark, and we should stop conning students that we do get a right mark for assignments, and start telling them that actually it's about judgment. So what I thought was, maybe we'll have a few more minutes you talking to your neighbours about the research, and out of that, if there are any particular questions you want to ask or points, and then I'll just talk a little bit about what I see as the implications for guidance for students and for marking reliability, and then we can have a sort of more open debate. And maybe now would be a time, if anybody wants to or didn't get a chance to get a drink, perhaps we just have a 5 or 6 minutes talking about that, and that, particularly the middle question there, perhaps, or whatever you want to talk about. Hi, thank you. Anybody want to ask any particular questions about the research at this stage?
Have you done any research about students marking their own stuff?
Well, there's loads of research on that.
Yeah.
There's loads of research on that.
And what,
Do you mean marking their own or marking other their peers?
marking their fellow students' work.
Yeah, there's loads.
Anything that can be learnt from that with regard to this discussion here?
Only that when all the studies that want to test whether students mark accurately always measure it against what the tutor would mark.
Right.
I'll finish there.
Okay.
And actually, there's plenty of work showing that students can do it well if supported and you know, helped to see the point of it and trained. But how do you tell whether it's accurate or not?
Were there major disciplinary differences between, say, you said you had chemistry in business, where there probably is more of a right answer?
Well, that's what we thought would happen, and they were doing problem questions for which they would normally have model answers, but we still got this variety of judgment, which we were surprised about that, I have to say, but we didn't find a difference. Even, I mean, there's a sort of sense, isn't there, that we've just been talking about it, you know, in science areas, it's more deterministic what's required and more right-wrong answers, but certainly that didn't come out.
Did you consider agreement as a variable? The old notion that, you know, in the context of an argument, you know, whether consciously or unconsciously, the marker, if he agrees with it, is going to give it a better mark. And he agrees with it.
Well, obviously, we only worked with what the tutor, the markers themselves, the constructs they elicited. So we weren't sort of laying anything on that. And that certainly didn't come out in the constructs, but it might not do, because that might be one of the sort of unconscious things that...
well, that's right. You've alluded to possibility of unconscious influences.
It didn't come out. Okay. Did you want to ask us?
Yeah, to what extent, I suppose, when you conceived the task, service people, did you view it as reflective of actual practice? The reason I ask is that you said at the very start things like surface level features tend to influence people a lot of people found that. Yet in this exercise, when you ask people the explicit thing, you know, rank these different features, they put the surface features at the bottom.
Yeah.
It means when you make something explicit, they're clearly drawn, their attention's drawn to something that they should be thinking about. And I wonder whether that permeates the exercise to some extent. So I don't know whether you impose time constraints on these people, or, you know, like marking is usually embedded within an institutional situation. So to what extent do you think what happened here reflects actual marking, or is more of a hypothetical thing about what problems are in making things better? Yeah,
well, I mean, as with all, I mean, one of the problems with researching marking, it's enormously difficult to do because you can't sort of observe it, which is why in other studies we've got people to do think aloud, and this was another way of trying to observe a bit more, but there are obviously limitations to it as a methodology. And we asked people to make notes, read them and make notes. I don't know whether they would have spent longer on that than they would normally, and I suspect, well, I know from doing think aloud and watching people mark, they spend very, very different lengths of time on the same piece of work. So we have that variability in marking practice anyway. You know, it's true that that's a limitation. Okay, I'll just do my last little bit of input and then we'll have a few questions. So I think, for me, one of the implications, apart from the fact that I do think that middle one is something that's worth discussion, one of the things that comes out of this for me, and from prior research, is that we can't rely on assessment criteria to communicate to students explicitly what's expected of them in their work. And we can't also rely on it to communicate to staff exactly what they should be looking for in marking, that there are limitations there. So I just want to spend a few minutes raising some ideas about this. And I have to say, I think there's some research practice, particularly in relation to students, and less in relation to staff. But let's look at the student guidance first. One of the big issues seems to me that, and from what students were saying way back when in my research, is that you need to really understand what the expectations are for that module, that tutor. at least to start off with. And a study in Australia, David Bowden and some colleagues there found that where they did a lot of work on this, it was about the 5th course, so I got halfway through the 2nd year, the students actually were able to take from helping them understand individual modules to getting a broader sense of what academic expectations were that they could sort of apply to all their work. I'll try and see if I can make sense of that. So I'm wondering whether what we need to think about in learning what standards are expected is we need to think about it in relation to how we've learned, how tutors learn. And that's not by going on a course or being told or just being given a set of criteria. And looking at the work on this, one of the things we learn, I think, is to take a holistic view of marking. So although we give students assessment criteria, the research shows that in general people, when they're marking, get an overview of a piece of work and say, I feel this is a 2-1, or I feel this is a 2-2. They don't say the structure's a 2-1 and the argument's whatever. So that we need to help students see their work in that holistic way, overall what the quality of it is. We also need to help them learn through looking at making real judgments and looking at real pieces of work. That's how we learn to mark. Is through being marked and then doing marking, and also talking to other people about our marking in moderation meetings or informally or whatever. It's something that takes place over time. You can't just learn what standards are for marking the first time. You have a go and you find that someone's second marked completely differently to you and you adjust your standards appropriately or whatever. The last two, I think, are also important, is that we have a sense of what's the context we're operating in. I don't know how many lecturers have a sense about how complex their judgment is, but certainly we know about things like moderation and external examiners and exam boards and all those things that are supposed to be wrap-around assessment to try and make it more secure for students and more fair. And also, one of the piece of research that's come out interestingly is that students are happier where they've developed a view of knowledge that sees it as contestable. So if they think they have a sort of dualist view that there's a right answer to this assignment and a wrong answer, then they want assessment criteria to, to just go on and get more and more detail, etc. Whereas if they have an understanding that there isn't a one right way to write this essay or whatever, then they're more accepting of general guidance and can work with that. So, these are areas that I'm very much kind of positing in a theoretical way, although some work has been done in this area. And one of the areas that work's been particularly done in recent years is to do with students working with real judgments using exemplars. And I just thought you might be interested in this. I've done a kind of review of a number. There's been quite a lot of recent studies where students are working with marking exemplars of assignments. And the sort of findings that are coming out is that students are starting to find them very positive exemplars at helping them understand what's really expected in a way that criteria don't. Because they get this kind of overall sense of quality, the appropriate structure and language and style. They get that better sense of what an overall piece of work looks like than they get from individual criteria. A number of the studies have shown how working with exemplars at early stages, often these are first-year students, helps them really have a confidence to tackle assessments because they've got an idea of what they're working towards in a much better way. There is evidence of improved marks across different ability levels. A big study done at Oxford Brookes found that students who participated in working with exemplars in a workshop had on average 1 degree classification higher. Fortunately, it was a massive course, 500 students, and only about half of them bothered to use this, so they were able to compare the half that came along to the workshop with the other half, who apparently didn't have any other different characteristics like entry points and such like. They found that made a significant difference, but because marking figures themselves are so dodgy, that's a bit of a difficult one. They tend to encourage students to make more holistic judgments about their work, which is one of the things we're saying tutors do. and also help them to recognise there's different ways of writing a good piece of work rather than being one right answer, and that links to this different views of knowledge. So in terms of getting inside what it is that a particular module is looking for, making exemplars available to students seems to be quite a useful technique, and it may be one that people here are using. What the research does say, though, that just make them available on their own isn't enough unless there's some kind of active engagement with them, like marking exercises, like some sort of structured discussion, so that students can learn from it. Something that forces them to think about the standards and build that tacit knowledge that the staff have. So there needs to be the kind of expert explanation alongside it. One of you, Jim, raised the issue about peer assessment, and one of the arguments is that marking exemplars is the same as peer assessment, but because it's one step back, it takes all that kind of emotionality away that students get very worried about, you know, not wanting to upset their friends and things like that. So they're still marking their peers' work, but it's peers from a previous year or sort of imaginary peers that they don't need to worry about. So, I mean, we could have a lot more of a discussion about this, but I think for me, that's the one of the key things is getting students involved with actually seeing real examples of good work for the course they're doing. And as I say, this Australian study found that students do this on a regular basis. Partway through their degree, they actually catch on to what's good for all courses, so to speak, by seeing it. I could talk a lot more about that, but given the time here, talking about the staff and the implications for fair marking, I think one of the big issues is that we need to think about moderation and calibration. So just talking first about moderation, this is from a piece of work that I've written recently with a couple of Australian lecturers who are very, very interested in, because they're getting their knickers in a real twist about standards in Australia at the moment, having not worried about it in the past in the way that we've done with the QA and such like. The argument here is that we put the emphasis on moderation at the beginning of the teaching period rather than the end of it or when the work comes in, so that we do pre-teaching moderation with the staff who are teaching a program, particularly where there's multiple staff involved, which you know, there are many huge programs in Australia, you know, with 2,000 students on or whatever, that the different staff actually discuss the design of the assessment, the criteria, and look at examples, so that, in a sense, it's likely to improve assessment design because people are talking about it rather than someone sitting in their room coming up with a set of essay titles, but also will inform the teaching and the dialogue with students. One of the things that's come out in, if you look at the quality comments in the NSS, the students say things like, well, we had the criteria, but lecturers were looking for different things, or lecturers told us different things in class. It wasn't fair, you know, they got more information than we did. So maybe if we have pre-discussion about what we're looking for, we might get more consistent explanation to students. And also actually have some development, some discussion of the standards amongst the course team. Perhaps on that basis, the end of moderation could focus on the really high stakes, the problem, the borderline cases, rather than, as we do now, moderating every module that a student completes, creating tons of work for us with actually very little evidence that it has any impact. It is interesting that this need for kind of social process among staff is already in the QAA guidance, the code of practice, the quality code for higher education. I think it's ahead of the university game here because they're already talking about practices which promote and support consistency, including dialogues. So that's there. And this is another example, as I say, from Australia, where they're doing a lot of work on this. They're looking at calibrating marking there. And there are various experiments going on. And one of them, this is an accountancy, where they brought together academics, senior academics from 20-plus accountancy departments in different universities. They gave them work to mark in advance, like we did, but when they came along, they really thrashed out whether this work was adequate to meet the learning outcomes and what marks it should get. And it was after that kind of thrashing out that the tutors then marked other work that they found that they really made a difference to the variability in judgment. They halved it. I have to say it went from a 28-point standard deviation or something to a 14-point. So it still wasn't brilliant, but it was significantly different. So I think this is really early days on this sort of stuff, but it does indicate the massive job we have to go to if we want to get consistent standards in universities and across universities, which we pretend we have in the UK. So there we are. I've really just thrown in some ideas there about the implications of this, and I've put some conclusions there. I think we provide empirical support for previous research, and as O'Hagan and Riggles have said, it probably, the research supports the view that who marks your essay becomes more important than the content of the essay itself. That's quite a strong comment to make, but it's worth thinking about. The different reasons we've come up with, I think, work in combination. I don't think more detailed answers to the criteria the answers at all. I think that takes away independence from students. It doesn't, and it also, I think that staff can't work with more and more detail. Will ignore it. It just won't work. We need to promote other forms of guidance to students, perhaps not striving for the right marks, but bringing students on board what's going on. I'm waiting for a university to feel brave enough to do that, sharing the nature of professional judgments with students. So there we are. I'm sorry that I probably could have spent longer on this section, but I wanted us to have time to debate it. So probably now's the time to, the questions that were raised earlier, people want to or make comments on this or suggestions both in terms of the research and the implications. Over to you. Go on,
doesn't an acknowledgement that marking is inherently flawed leave the door open to disputation of marks and getting involved and thank students who become serial arguers about their marks? I mean, I'm starting to see a bit of that already.
I think it does, but it's definitely, that's why I don't think anyone is going down that road at all, because everyone is too terrified that it'll land up with more appeals and complaints. On the other hand, we have, I don't think it's an accident that we successively get very poor satisfaction from students in this area, and compared with their general satisfaction, because they know, at heart, I think they know that assessment just doesn't feel fair a lot of the time, and but I don't think we need to do it in the, there is no right answer. We need to do it much more about developing students' understanding of what professional judgment is, because we're basically educating students to be professionals in a whole range of areas, even if they're going to do some postgraduate training. We need to help them see that professional judgment in all sorts of areas, doctors, lawyers, we've got lots of lawyers here today, and engineers, or whatever, they all have to make professional judgments. Often, those judgments have to be looked at by someone else. You get a second opinion. They rarely can be exactly the right answer, and we need to start bringing them into that. My view is that if we show students that, I don't know how many assignments they do in an average course, across 3 years, I don't know, 40, 50, loads, that it's the balance of the mark. All those different judgments by different staff, we can see the pattern. If that pattern's all over the place, then maybe we do need to bring in other markers and we need to look down at it. But we shouldn't be trying to get a right mark for every single piece. We should make sure that overall our university processes give them a sense of fair dealing. That's my feeling. Until someone is prepared to kind of develop this, it'll probably just continue to irritate students and we'll continue to get low satisfaction. Yeah, well, okay, there was, Margaret, I think, Marion had her hand up first.
The implications for the institution are so interesting. I remember when I first came here, people used to say, that's a kind of children's student. Now, no one would dare to say that because all the time it was thought that objectivity was appearing. Now, you have very successfully undermined that objectivity, which I must say many people didn't believe in anyway. But take, for example, law, professional standards, you're not labelling people, whether they're able to go into a particular profession or not. You're labelling them for the rest of their lives, for salary, for career progression. So actually telling students that they are relying on judgment, which I think is all they can do, is asking them to be very mature. It's also asking staff to be more mature in the way that they engage with students and the whole sort of dialogue about what assessment. But it also needs to include the university itself, so that these algorithms that people throw out onto spreadsheets are known to be fallible.
Yes. Well, algorithms is another whole debate altogether. I mean, you go to one university with one set of marks, you'll get a 2-1. You go to the same set of marks to another university, another algorithm, you'll get a 2-2 or a first. I mean, they're a...
And the regulations, the way they manipulate all these judgments and so on.
Absolutely. I agree with you. It is about a maturity. But I also think, I don't think currently students are being that badly dealt with because of all the different assessment opportunities they get and the different pattern of marks, the pattern of marks that comes from that. What I do think, though, is that we still encourage them to think that there's a right mark for each one rather than a general pattern. They're marked by 20 different lecturers over the course of their degree. That pattern gives us an idea of roughly what's fair and what isn't, and that's why we need to look closely at the borderline. Anyway, Joe, you were waving your hand.
Well, I was sort of going back to this kind of two sides of the argument that's developing a bit, and how risk-taking do we become in informing students that knowledge is contested. That seems to be really at the heart of it.
Yeah.
Sharing the nature of professional judgment with students seems to me to be something that helps them to mature, to understand, that when they go out into the world they will meet different opinions about their work and so on. But it's a very painful process and it's very risky for universities because of the legislation. I'm just illustrating from the undergraduate programme that I know best, which was a very interdisciplinary kind of programme. It was psychology and education. And I think students really got very confused and puzzled by the fact that there were different disciplinary values involved for them. So, they would learn to be a positivist if it was somebody marking their work, and a very reflexive, qualitative researcher if it was somebody else. And, I mean, actually it was, in the end, at the end of 3 years, perhaps that learning was really, really helpful to them. They learned that knowledge is contested. But there's a lot of pain to start for everybody involved on the way. So I'm not offering any solutions.
No, but I do think you raise the point there that we don't talk to students about this, do we? And maybe if we talk to them a bit more about it right from the beginning, and also involving students in assessing themselves, doing peer assessment, which is shown to be so valuable for helping them get inside standards. I mean, I didn't talk about that much there, but that's that kind of making judgments. Then perhaps it needn't be quite as painful if they come to understand why this is going on. Anyway.
I want to jump in because I've got to go to a meeting to talk about university education strategy in a moment. So before I get too confused, I'm picking up on Joe's comment. One of the, you talked about the NSS issue. One of the things that I'm working on at the moment there is the additional problems you have with people doing joint degrees, where of course you get this difference across disciplinary standards with a vengeance, really. There's a tendency as well, I think, for students to muddle the message in the sense that what we might see as a disciplinary or sub-disciplinary difference, they see the difference between the people who are teaching those things. So just thinking back to the examples that you had, we probably can think of exactly the same illustrative case where there's a person who was seen as being like this who taught a certain kind of course, and those two things get muddled up. But I'd go back again to the difference between formative and summative, because it's I mean, your comment about how lawyers make judgment about who's going to get into the profession and so on and what level is absolutely right. When you go to the way universities themselves respond to a high-stakes test like the REP or TEC, and we do exactly the same thing, and we behave in exactly the same way. You're always going to get that. So unless there's a separation very, very clearly, formative, where you can begin to explore some of these issues, and the summative, I think you're really onto hiding to nothing. So perhaps the solution is to do away with all summative assessment apart from end of program examinations.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you can spend the rest of the 3 years inducting students with understanding what this is all about.
Yeah, exactly. No, I have a huge amount of sympathy with that, and I think, again, the research on assessment shows that the way what we've done to assessment by having modular structures is we've killed the learning potential of it. Absolutely killed it. So, but we need to stop, you know, I was talking here about students won't do formative assessment. Well, I actually think that's complete rubbish. They won't do it if they think that it's just other extra assessment they have to do that doesn't count. If it's actually about how we teach, I mean, kids do formative assessment all the time in the year before they come here. For their A-levels, they're doing homework all week, you know, every week that doesn't count to the actual A-level grade. Because it's it's part of the learning teaching experience, whereas at universities we've separated it. So I'm very in support of that, although I wouldn't have exams all at the end.
Okay, well, but
I know what you're saying.
I mean, the other point is that you mentioned what they do before they come here, and the thing that bothers me is that universities seem, at the moment, to be moving in a direction that schools are actually now beginning to move away from because of the changes in the A-level. She's going to have a formative 2 years with an end of course examination of one kind or another.
Yeah.
While we are busy doing away with the end of course examination and assessment every 5 years at the university. And I think a lot of it is to do with conflict between what they come from and what they're now trying to do. And the lack of understanding that transition is also part of it.
I think there's a great danger in trying to do away with summative coursework because for many of our students it's the only way they're getting through the module. We remove some of the coursework and rely on an end of programme assessment, then our failure rates are going to go up dramatically.
Yes, well,
that I don't think that we can I mean, I agree it would probably improve academic standards, but possibly at the expense of breaking the university.
I think there's a danger.
We don't do it together. So we don't go down.
The idea of removing one thing, none of these things I think are ever initiatives in their own right, though, are they? It's about being part of a whole package of involving students and things like that. So yeah, okay, if you just take out the summative bits and do nothing else, you might have a disastrous thing. But if you take out those and reframe the way you teach, reframe the relationship with students, ask students, see what they will or won't put up with rather than sort of say, students don't like this. I mean, I know a course in Australia, an undergraduate course, where they abolished marks, and the students went along with it because the rationale was explained to them. It took a lot of trouble. They had to go through to the professional body, but the professional body backed it. It was an engineering course. Because the idea being that when you are in professional practice, you build a bridge, it stays up, it falls down. It's no use having a bridge that's 66% of a good bridge. And that's why in medicine, they don't have great medicine because there's no use being 66% alive.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, there's the scope to renegotiate with our students here that we often close down the debate before it begins.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And I think there's a halfway house between everything being right at the end and having I don't know how big your credits are here these days. What size of your modules, units?
15.
Yeah, 15. I mean, if we had 60 credit, 2 units or modules per year, then you would still have students having some sense of, progress, but without having all these dozens of bits, which create huge amounts of work for you, because they count summatively, they've all got to be moderated, external examiners got to see them, they've all got to, all that stuff, which doesn't make them very good for learning. Because somebody...
Yeah, I wanted to more of an observation about exemplars, because we started using them, and the students have found them quite helpful. But one of the interesting things that we didn't necessarily expect, we started putting up examples of good work. And then there was a strong demand that they didn't want to see good work. What they wanted to see was mediocre work. Because they knew they didn't produce good work already. That's why they didn't want to see them. because they just put them off somewhere, because they thought, well, that's nothing like I've ever written. That's a horrifying prospect. I'll never be that good. So they wanted to see something a bit more granular, so they could see where they sat.
Yeah.
Within a range, and it was quite interesting. It's also quite difficult to get people who write C sort of stuff to give you permission to put it up online. So we had found a practical problem of getting access to sort of mediocre examples to use for teaching. But
no, that's an interesting point. And as I said, I did that kind of a bit of a review of recent articles on that, and people in general were quite. Were generally did things like gave students a mixed set of examples. So they got some poor work, some medium work, and some good work. I remember one article saying specifically they didn't give the top grade because they thought, A, it would encourage copying more, and also for the sorts of reasons you've talked about, that maybe it set the bar too high, or gave an impression that there was one sort of way of doing it, whereas getting a slightly lower set of exemplars gave more to talk about, more for them to suggest improvement.
Yeah, because I was worried initially when we started that if you gave the good one, it was a model answer, and we've always avoided trying to say there's a model answer, and then all of a sudden you've created.
Absolutely, and that's this kind of view of knowledge thing. We shouldn't be giving students the idea that there's a model answer in any assignment where a whole range of different answers could be equally good. I absolutely agree with that. That does encourage copying everything, and it doesn't encourage them to think about the assignment quality.
So we end there. So if I could just say thank you to Sue very much.
Okay.
As I promised, I think you've got lots to go away to think about. If you are interested in assessment, Dee said it was all right to mention this. There is another seminar on assessment on the 4th of May. So you'd be very welcome to that. That's given by me. But more important to that is in 2 weeks we have our next department seminar, which is Peter Twining, who's Professor of Education Futures at the Open University, and he'll be looking at ICT in schools, looking back, looking forward. So hope to see you there, or any of our other seminars.